February 18, 1942, Changi Prison, Singapore. A nurse folds a letter under the weak light of a kerosene lamp. Outside, the night hums with insects, and the muffled sound of boots on gravel. She seals the envelope with trembling fingers and writes on the back, "Do not open until after the war." But before the lamp, before the walls, there was sunlight, white, unbroken, spilling across the tiled corridors of the Tanglin Military Hospital. Margaret Meg Ellison had arrived in Singapore 2 years earlier, fresh from London, in a starch white uniform that wilted instantly in the tropical heat. The air smelled of hibiscus and disinfectant. The nurses joked that one scent was for life, the other for keeping it. Her days began with the whir of ceiling fans and ended with the slow rhythm of monsoon rain hammering on corrugated roofs. She wrote to her fiancé in Portsmouth every Sunday. "The men are mostly malaria and heat stroke cases. I'm learning to make gauze feel like comfort." In those early months, the war was something that happened elsewhere, in headlines, in rumors, in the radio static drifting from the officers' mess. Singapore was said to be impregnable, a phrase repeated with the same certainty as prayer. The city shone under a kind of colonial order, as if the empire's light could not dim here, 12,000 miles from home. Yet, beneath the calm, Meg noticed small ruptures. Convoys of ambulances moving north at dawn, trains loaded with wounded soldiers from Malaya, the steady exodus of civilians, their luggage tied with rope and silence. She began to write more often, shorter notes, half-thoughts, letters that said less than they meant. "I think of the sound of rain on the tin roof and how far away thunder can feel." By December 1941, thunder had become real. The first air raids came without warning. A low droning, a pause, then the glass shattering inward. The hospital shook. Meg and the other nurses dragged stretchers into the corridor as the sirens wailed through the afternoon heat. She remembered holding the hand of a young corporal who asked, "Is it far to home?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Still, life persisted in rituals. Clean sheets, counted bandages, whispered prayers. Each act of care felt like defiance. The matron, Dr. Kathleen Adams, used to say, "Order is sanity." So they polished instruments even when water ran brown from the taps, even when shells fell on the outskirts of the city. Christmas came quietly in 1941. The nurses sang hymns under blackout conditions, candles hidden in enamel mugs. Meg's letter that week began, "No one speaks of tomorrow anymore, but I find I still wash my hands before every meal. Habit, I suppose, or faith." When the Japanese crossed the Johor Strait in February 1942, the illusion ended. Columns of refugees streamed past the hospital gates, Indian sepoys, British civilians, Chinese laborers. The smell of smoke thickened, the horizon glowed. The doctors burned patient records in oil drums. One by one, the nurses packed small satchels, photographs, handkerchiefs, a fountain pen, the things that could fit between loss and duty. Meg stayed behind with the wounded. She wrote a final pre-surrender note. "If this reaches you, know that I am where I should be, among the living, still trying to keep them so." Then came silence. The guns fell quiet on February 15th. 3 days later, the Union Jack was lowered over Singapore, and in the ruins of Tanglin Hospital, under the ceiling fans that no longer turned, a new routine began, one that no nurse had ever been trained for. The silence after surrender was not peace. It was the sound of boots on marble floors, the flutter of white flags hanging limp in the heat. Singapore had fallen, but the air still trembled, thick with smoke and disbelief. Meg stood at the shattered window of Tanglin Hospital, watching Japanese trucks grind to a halt outside the gates. The Red Cross emblem painted on the roof had not saved them. A young Japanese soldier shouted orders through a megaphone. His words came clipped, sharp, bouncing off the walls. The British doctors were herded into one line, the nurses into another. No one resisted. They simply stared at their own shadows stretching across the courtyard. The occupation began in an hour. The hospital was stripped of its medicines, its stores, its flags. Meg was assigned to lead a group of 20 nurses, all to be marched to Changi, once a British barracks, now a prison. She carried a small case, a few medical instruments, a packet of morphine ampules, and a letter she never finished writing. The road to Changi was 15 miles of ruined city. Dead cars lined the roadside. Telephone poles leaned like broken ribs. Civilians watched from shuttered windows, Malay, Chinese, Eurasians, their faces still registering the sudden shift of power. The nurses walked in formation, silent under the weight of their armbands. Somewhere, the sound of a radio still played a British march tune before cutting to static. By nightfall, the gates of Changi closed behind them. What had been neat parade grounds were now crowded with prisoners, soldiers, clerks, teachers, men in tattered khaki uniforms. The air smelled of sweat and rust. They were given a single block, 12 rooms for over 100 women, bamboo mats on concrete floors, tin bowls, a trickle of water from a pipe that coughed more air than liquid. Meg looked around and said quietly, "We'll make it clean." It wasn't bravado, it was instinct. Within days, the rhythm of captivity began. Roll call at dawn, bowing to guards, rations of rice gruel. The Japanese commandant, Lieutenant Tokunaga, issued orders through an interpreter. Obedience, silence, labor. Any infraction meant beatings. Yet beneath the regime, life reorganized itself in the small acts of survival. Meg turned a storeroom into a ward. Dr. Adams requisitioned bandages from torn uniforms, disinfectant from ashes and boiled rainwater. They found a way to sterilize instruments using a battered kerosene stove. In the evenings after lights out, the women whispered medical instructions in code. The sick were visitors, the dying were departures, and the letters began. Meg wrote by memory, not by hope. Paper was rationed, ink made from crushed charcoal and condensed milk. She wrote on scraps of old Red Cross reports in the margins of Japanese announcements, on the backs of inventory lists. Each letter began the same. "My dearest Tom, another day of ward duty, nothing unusual." Each was a lie meant to preserve a truth, that she was still herself. She never signed her full name, just M. At first, she hid them beneath her mattress. Later, inside the lining of her medical bag. As conditions worsened, dysentery, dengue, exhaustion, the letters became shorter, steadier, like pulse readings of a fading world. One evening, as thunder rolled in from the sea, a Dutch nurse named Hester asked, "Why do you still write, Meg?" "They'll never reach him." Meg answered, "Then perhaps they'll reach someone." Outside, the monsoon broke, rain hammering against the tin roofs, flooding the yard, washing away footprints. For a few moments, the sound drowned out everything. The guards' voices, the groans from the sickbay, even the fear. It was the first true silence she had heard since the surrender. Not the silence of defeat, but the heavy, breathing quiet that came when the world refused to end. The next morning she found her pen rusted from the damp, but she kept writing anyway. The days in Changi blurred like light behind mosquito netting, too bright, then too dark, too long to measure. There was no calendar now, only the rhythm of the guards' whistles, the clatter of ration tins, the cough that never stopped echoing in the infirmary. Meg rose before dawn, before the compound stirred. The air at that hour was the only cool thing left in the tropics. She boiled water on a rusted stove, filtered it through gauze until it tasted faintly of smoke. That first sip was ritual, a reminder that time still moved even when the sun refused to rise. Her hands had changed. The skin was thin and mottled, her knuckles raw from disinfectant made of ash and lime. She wrote in her mind before she ever found paper, sentences she might remember long enough to write later if she dared. Today, the fever broke. I held her hand until morning. Then she'd file it away in her thoughts, like a note in a drawer that no one would open. Every morning the roll call began. The women stood barefoot in lines, counting aloud in Japanese. Some fainted from heat, others stared straight ahead, their faces expressionless masks of obedience. Lieutenant Tokunaga inspected them silently, his uniform immaculate even in the humidity. He bowed curtly and moved on. Beneath the formality, there was something inscrutable. Not cruelty exactly, but distance, as if he too had become part of a machine that none of them could stop. After roll call came work detail. For Meg, that meant the infirmary. 6 cots for 40 patients, bamboo splints, improvised drips made from glass bottles, a syringe sterilized over a candle flame. She learned to treat infection with salt water, pain with whispered prayers. The line between nurse and prisoner blurred until the duties became the only form of freedom she knew. Food arrived once a day, a ladle of rice, sometimes mixed with sweet potato peelings or papaya seeds. The women measured it carefully, using a tin lid to divide portions. Some traded their share for medicine, others gave theirs away in silence. Meg always kept a few grains in her pocket for the birds that landed on the fence. It was Hester who first found the notebook, an old Japanese exercise book, half burned, pages still intact. Together they began writing medical notes in code, hills for fevers, oceans for wounds, rain for blood. Between the coded lines, Meg slipped fragments of her letters. If kindness still exists, it will find its way through wire. At night, they listened to the world through sound. The jungle outside was alive. Cicadas, frogs, the rustle of something moving through leaves. Sometimes distant gunfire from the sea. The nurses whispered the sounds to each other like bedtime stories. Rain tonight, trucks on the road, someone singing in the men's camp. One evening, a young guard caught Meg tending to a feverish prisoner after curfew. His bayonet flashed, his voice hard. She bowed low, her palms open in apology. Tokunaga appeared, spoke to the guard in short, cold syllables. The soldier lowered his weapon and walked away. Meg never knew what was said. She only remembered Tokunaga's eyes. Not pity, not approval, something like fatigue. Later, when she returned to her corner, Hester was asleep, her breath shallow. Meg sat and began another letter, her handwriting tight to conserve ink. The rain came again tonight. The roof leaks near the doorway. I think of your voice when I cannot sleep. We are all still working. Still here. The candle burned low, its smoke curling like ink on the air. She folded the paper, pressed it flat, and slipped it between the pages of the medical notebook. By morning, the sun would rise again over the same fences, the same faces, the same ritual of surviving one more day, and Meg would begin it all again, washing hands, counting pulses, rewriting the world so it could be endured. The air smelled of rain and decay. A monsoon had rolled through the previous night, leaving the compound slick with mud. The roofs leaked, the walls sweated, and the fever ward overflowed. Meg moved among the cots barefoot, her skirt hem darkened by water. The patients lay still, skin taut over bones. eyes that no longer opened. She counted pulses with 2 fingers and wrote nothing down. There was no paper left. At noon, the order came. "Japanese soldiers wounded from the dockside bombing," said Tokunaga through an interpreter. "They will be brought here." The words landed like stones. The women stopped moving. Meg heard one of them whisper, "Not here, not after what they've done." But the commandant's face was expressionless. "You will care for them," he said, "as you would your own." The guards carried the wounded men in on stretchers. Burns, shrapnel wounds, faces bandaged until they were barely human. The nurses hesitated, hands stiff at their sides. These were the same uniforms that had marched them through the city streets, the same insignia stitched above bayonets that gleamed in the sun. Meg stepped forward first. She knelt beside the nearest soldier, his body trembling under the fever. She reached for her basin, dipped the rag into cloudy water, and began to clean his wounds. The blood was fresh, the smell sharp. Her fingers worked without thought, years of training moving through her like muscle memory. Someone behind her muttered, "You're helping them." Meg didn't answer. She wrung the cloth, wiped again. "He's dying," she said simply. The room filled with the sound of quiet labor, the tearing of cloth, the slow rhythm of water dripping into bowls. One by one, the other nurses began to move. A Dutch sister held a bandage to a soldier's leg. Another spooned water into a burned man's mouth. The prisoners watched from the doorway, silent as enemies tended enemies. That night, after the guards had gone, Meg sat alone beside the stove. Her hands shook, the same hands that had bound the wounds of men who, weeks earlier, had shot civilians in the street. She tried to write, but found no words. The charcoal stub left smears across her fingers. When Hester came to sit beside her, neither spoke for a long while. The rain returned, soft on the tin roof. Finally, Hester said, "You did what a nurse does." Meg looked down at her hands. "I did what I could," she replied. Then quieter, almost to herself, "But I don't know what that means anymore." The paradox lingered in the air, heavier than the heat. Mercy without reward, duty without allegiance. In the camp, rumors spread that Tokunaga had requested the nurse's aid at his own risk. Some said he'd bowed to Meg in private. No one knew for certain. The only truth was that the wounded Japanese soldiers lived, and a few of the Allied women who had helped them later received extra rations. It was impossible to tell whether it was gratitude or manipulation. Weeks passed. The soldiers recovered enough to be taken away. Their stretchers left faint grooves in the dirt. Meg swept the floor clean, though she knew the marks would return with the next rain. That night she wrote one last line before sleep. "There is no side in suffering, only the shape it takes in a man's eyes." When she finished, she didn't fold the letter. She burned it. The paper curled inward, turning words to ash. The next morning, the guards ordered the nurses to scrub the floors of the command building. Meg obeyed as always, her hands red and raw. Yet in the stillness of that day, she realized something had shifted. Not in the camp, not in Tokunaga, but inside herself. Compassion had become her rebellion and silence her weapon. By 1944, the war had devoured even the days. No one marked them anymore. The jungle pressed closer to the camp, its roots curling through the fence, reclaiming what men had tried to control. The women no longer spoke of the outside world. The world had shrunk to the distance between their cots. The rains came harder that year. Roofs sagged, walls wept. Food became a rumor. Rice mixed with weevils, thin soup with a taste of rust. The weakest no longer rose for roll call. The guards stopped counting precisely. Disease did it for them. Meg woke one morning to find Hester gone, her blanket neatly folded, her shoes still beside the mat. There had been no cry, no fever breaking. Just absence, clean, complete. Meg sat beside the empty space until the light changed, then folded the blanket again, as if that small act could close the wound. That night she began burning her letters. She fed them into the flame one by one, watching the ink lift away like smoke. The air filled with the faint scent of milk and charcoal, the makeshift ink she'd made months earlier. She told herself it was mercy, that no one should find them, that truth in the wrong hands could condemn the living. But part of her knew it was surrender, not to despair, but to memory itself. Some things were too heavy to survive their own telling. Only one envelope she kept, the last. She wrote it carefully in the dim light of a candle stub. If these words are ever found, let them belong to no one. We were not heroes. We were simply afraid of forgetting how to be human. She folded it twice, sealed it with wax from the candle, and slid it inside the hollow of a medical manual. Surgery for field and base hospitals, pages swollen from humidity. It fit perfectly between amputation and aftercare. The next day, Tokunaga came to the ward. His face was gaunter now, his uniform stained at the cuffs. He walked the aisle between the cots, eyes scanning the room. When he stopped beside Meg, he spoke in English, halting, formal. "You no burn things," he said, gesturing toward the ash bin. Meg froze. The remnants of her letters still smoldered faintly in the pail. She bowed deeply. "Hi," she whispered. He stared a moment longer, then turned and left. No punishment came. No word was spoken. Only a long silence that hung in the air like a suspended breath. Outside, rumors moved through the camp like wind. The Allies advancing, the Japanese retreating, ships sunk in the Pacific. Hope was whispered and forbidden in the same breath. For some, it was poison. For others, the last medicine. One afternoon, a new group of prisoners arrived. Men skeletal and blind with malaria, released from a labor camp up country. The nurses were ordered to tend them. Meg recognized the smell before she saw the faces, the smell of decay that clung to those who had been too close to death for too long. She knelt beside one man whose voice was little more than breath. "England," he rasped. "Someday," she answered. That night she dreamed of snow, white streets, cold air, her fiancé waiting on a pier that never existed. When she woke, the heat pressed down like a weight. The dream felt like another person's life. By mid-45, the camp was a skeleton of itself. The guards grew quieter, their salutes sloppier, their eyes sunken. The women could feel the war turning, even if they dared not name it. One evening, thunder cracked across the sky. For a heartbeat, the power returned to the floodlights, a harsh white glare flooding the compound. Meg looked up and saw her reflection in the window pane, thin, hollow-eyed, but still standing, still holding the line between care and collapse. In that brief moment of light, she realized she had crossed some invisible threshold, the place where endurance no longer looked like strength, but like surrender disguised as grace. When the lights went out again, she did not move. On the morning of September 5th, 1945, the guards did not come. The compound bell remained silent. The air was unnaturally still, as though the jungle itself had paused to listen. Meg stood at the doorway of the infirmary, her heartbeat too loud in the quiet. Across the yard, a few prisoners wandered out cautiously, shielding their eyes from the light. By midday, a small group of British officers arrived through the gates. Thin, dust-covered men wearing unfamiliar armbands marked with the rising sun crossed out in ink. One of them shouted, voice cracking, "It's over! Japan has surrendered!" No one moved. A few women laughed, short, dry bursts that turned to sobs. Meg sat down slowly, her legs refusing to hold her. After 3.5 years, the word over had lost meaning. The world she had built inside her, of measured silence, of rationed mercy, had no place beyond those walls. When the relief forces entered Changi the next day, cameras followed. They filmed the emaciated faces, the medical tents, the heaps of letters and belongings. Someone handed Meg a chocolate bar. She took a bite and wept, not for joy, but for the taste of sweetness that her body no longer knew how to accept. The official report called it liberation. To Meg, it felt like waking from a fever into a body she no longer recognized. She returned to the ward one last time before the men came to clear it. The cots were empty now, sheets stripped, the walls marked with initials and dates. Near the stove, she found the medical manual still where she'd hidden it. The pages were swollen, the spine split, but the envelope was dry. She didn't open it. She simply ran her thumb over the edge of the wax seal and placed the book on the table. When the Red Cross convoy departed for the docks, she climbed aboard with the others. The truck rattled past the wire fences, past the sentry posts now abandoned, past the field where they had once stood for roll call. Through the open gate, the sea glittered, wide, endless, almost cruel in its brightness. A British officer offered her a seat near the front. "You'll be going home soon," he said kindly. She looked at him and gave a small smile. "Home?" she repeated, as if testing a word she'd once known. At the harbor, she helped lift the stretchers aboard. The air smelled of salt and diesel. Somewhere, a gramophone played a scratchy rendition of "There'll Always Be an England." She stood by the rail, watching Singapore recede into the haze, her hands gripping the rusted metal. In the hospital at Rangoon, she began to write again. Brief reports for the medical board, inventories of survivors. The doctors praised her composure. They called her a model of endurance. No one asked about the letters. She never mentioned them. When she reached London weeks later, the streets looked the same. Buses rumbling, fog rising from the Thames, the faint glow of lamplight through rain. But she moved through it like a ghost. Her fiancé met her at Victoria Station. He didn't recognize her at first. Neither did she. At night, she dreamed of water dripping from bamboo roofs, of footsteps on gravel, of the sound of her own voice reciting names. The body healed, but memory didn't. It lingered, persistent as humidity. Years passed. Meg never spoke publicly of Changi. She worked quietly in hospitals until her retirement. The box that held her wartime effects remained sealed, a Red Cross armband, a fountain pen, and the single letter that no one was ever meant to read. In 1986, during an archive inventory at the Imperial War Museum, a curator opened a small parcel marked "Property of M. Ellison, Q. Ims." Inside lay the faded envelope, the seal unbroken. He hesitated before opening it. The letter was lighter than it looked, now its paper brittle, edges curled like dried leaves. The curator, a quiet man named Stephen Hale, adjusted his gloves and broke the wax with a sound so faint it seemed almost apologetic. Inside were 2 pages written in darkened, uneven strokes, ink made of soot and something sweet that time had turned sepia. The handwriting was steady, careful. If these words are ever found, let them belong to no one. We were not brave. We were frightened, and we did what frightened people do. We worked, we obeyed, we loved when we could. If you read this after the war, know that it was not victory that kept us alive, but the small mercies we refuse to forget. Stephen read it twice. The air in the archive felt different, not heavier exactly, but slower, as if the room itself were listening. The letter ended without a signature, just the single initial M. He set the pages beneath the lamp, and the faint watermark of hospital paper revealed itself. Tanglin Military Hospital, Singapore, 1941. The ink had bled into the fibers like veins. On the second page, a final line stood alone. We survived by pretending we hadn't. He exhaled quietly. Outside the window, London rain traced thin silver lines down the glass. The world moved on, as it always did. Cars, voices, footsteps. The city unbroken, unaware that in one archive drawer, a nurse had spoken across 4 decades of silence. That night, Stephen filed the letter under personal testimonies. Civilian Medical Corps, Southeast Asia. Before he closed the folder, he looked again at the handwriting. The words carried a kind of restraint he had only seen in those who had lived too long with memory. The file slipped into place with a soft sound, one voice among thousands. Yet its presence changed the air the way an old melody does when it's hummed in an empty room. In the museum reading hall, visitors would one day read excerpts from it, printed on cream placards. Changi, 1942-45. Letters found in medical archives. Author unknown. They would pause for a moment, lean closer, then move on to the next exhibit. Photographs of emaciated women, diaries in fading ink, a Red Cross armband under glass. None would know the smell of rain on tin roofs, the heat that never ended, or the weight of writing words meant to be unread. But for an instant, they would feel it, the quiet pulse of someone who had once stood in a place where mercy was an act of rebellion. And somewhere in that silence, the story continued, not as history, not as legend, but as the brief flicker of recognition between strangers across time. Meg Ellison's name remained in no official role. Her file was small, her photograph missing. But her letter, the one she'd written in the dim light of Changi, sealing it with wax from a candle that smoked and sputtered, became part of the museum's permanent collection. Every year on the anniversary of Singapore's fall, the staff rotated the exhibit. The letter remained in storage most of the time, kept in darkness to preserve its fragile paper. Yet each time it was read, each time the words were spoken aloud, it was as though the ink warmed again. The sound of rain returned, and the faint rustle of a nurse's skirt moved somewhere far away. No epilogue, no commentary. Only this, a page under glass, a voice preserved in silence, and the echo of someone who wrote not to be remembered, but to make sure remembering was still possible.